click is all it takes to lose everything.
We are in a cyber war. You can either be a defendant or you could be a victim.
Organizations are so focused on logging, but what they don't realize, too much logging can actually be a liability. And let me explain. If we go back 5 or 6 years ago, the reason why 90% of attacks were not being detected by organizations was because they had zero logs. They had no visibility, they had no idea what was going on. Remember, an incident is an adverse event or the threat of an adverse event against your organization. Events are entries in your log files. So in order to detect adverse events, in order to determine whether you're compromised, we have to have the logs. No logs, no events, no clue what's going on, and that's why organizations have been blinded for so long. Now, a year or two ago, based on all the regulations, right, we're here in Europe with GDPR and all the other regulations out there, companies started turning on all this logging, and at first I thought it was a good idea. Here's the problem. Companies are now generating so many logs, they have no resources and no people to go through them. And really now what they're doing is they're capturing all this evidence about what's happening in their organization, and because nobody's looking at it, it's actually creating a huge liability. So I never thought I would say this, but with a lot of these companies, they would actually be better off not logging than logging and not looking at or getting useful information. Because basically you have 3 stages. You have no logging, where you pretend logs don't exist, and you see no evil, hear no evil. And unfortunately, there are companies that play in that space because here's what they think. If we're not looking at the attacks, if we don't know that we have a breach, we don't have to report. Because all the regulations say, if you believe that data's been compromised, you have to tell people. But if you're not looking and you have no clue, there's no negative short-term implication. Now, what these companies are failing to realize is by closing their eyes and saying, we're not looking at, so we're not going to detect attacks, they are going to catch it in 2 or 3 years when the problem's really big. So it's better to catch the problem when it's small. So stage 1 is no logging. Stage 2, which is what I call the danger zone, is where you're logging but not looking at the logs. That's where you have all the liability and none of the benefit. Then you get to the 3rd stage, which is where you're logging and looking at the information and analyzing it. The problem is that 3rd stage needs to be all information that's logged, you are looking at and getting benefit, and unfortunately that's not where companies are today. Companies tend to be more in that middle danger zone where they're logging all this information and only looking at a small amount. Well, here's the problem. If you're logging 100,000 entries an hour and your team can only look at 10, what's the probability that you're going to find the information that really matters? 0, and I can prove it. All these major incidents that you've read about over the last 2 years, when I've gone back to those companies and me and my team have spent weeks going through the logs, the attack is always there. There's always evidence of the attack. It wasn't invisible. The problem is the company completely and totally missed it because they were logging way too much information. So if you want to get rid of the liability, it's simple. How many logs can your team actually analyze a day? And that's how much you should generate. If you can only go in and look at 100 logs a day, you should only be generating 100 logs. But Eric, I'm going to miss some attacks. Yes, but at least you'll catch some, because the problem today is you're missing everything. So you have to prioritize. What are the most critical logs to your organization? Log that and use it, and then either get more resources or get outside help. But if you are logging information and not looking at it and not using it, it's not a benefit, it's a liability.